So now we're going to introduce our speakers tonight.
Vamos a presentar quienes van a hablar esta noche.
CALVIN REID is Senior News Editor at Publishers Weekly. He was instrumental in encouraging Publishers Weekly to begin regularly reviewing book format comics in the late 1980s, in addition to launching regular news coverage of graphic novel publishing at Publishers Weekly in the early 1990s, making PW instrumental in the rapid growth of the graphic novel category in the general book trade. In 2006, at the annual Will Eisner Comic Industry Awards, CALVIN was awarded the Bob Clampett Humanitarian Award by the San Diego Comic-Con International for his longtime efforts in graphic novel publishing.
CALVIN REID es un editor jefe en Publishers Weekly. Fue instrumental en hacer que Publishers Weekly empiece a revisar y criticar historietas en los años 80 y lanzó la cobertura habitual del género de la novela gráfica a comienzos de los años 90. En 2006, Reed recibió el premio humanitario Bob Clampett, otorgado por el San Diego Comic Con International por su trabajo en el ámbito de la publicación de las novelas gráficas.
I'm sure he knows he needs some introduction. However, we're going to anyway. Junot Diaz was born in Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, and is the author of Drown and The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, which won the John Sargent First Novel Prize, the National Book Critics Circle Award, the Anisfield Wolf Book Award, the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, and the 2008 Pulitzer Prize. His most recent book, which we're celebrating the deluxe edition release of tonight, illustrated by Jaime Hernandez, is This Is How You Lose Her. His fiction has also appeared in The New Yorker, African Voices,
This is awesome. I mean, I've never been up here. I've heard about it, and now I've got the best seat in the house. Not bad.
Hi guys. First of all, I want to thank Word Up, favorite bookstore uptown. Thank you guys for organizing this. Of course, Calvin, my interlocutor. I wanted to thank United Palace for hosting us, all the folks who made this possible this evening, and of course, finally for everyone who made time. It is Friday night. I don't know what the fuck y'all doing here. I appreciate you coming to support the arts, man, for real. You know, I always think it's, this is the one place where I could be like, the other day I was somewhere and I asked, were there any Dominicans in the audience? And like, nobody raised their fucking hand. Super depressed. So I guess I have to ask first, is there any Dominicans in the audience? Yeah, what's up? Any immigrants in the audience? Gotta talk about that, man. How about folks of African descent? Oh yeah! You notice I'm naming everyone who has to claim me one way or the other. Lots of claims. Yeah. Anyway, thank you guys for being here. Really, really appreciate it.
And ditto for me. Thanks for inviting me. It's a thrill. Jaime and Junot together at last. This is a book, a special edition. It was special at first, and then somehow you made it just a little bit more special. At some point, I brought a copy, just in case.
Hope they gave it to you, man.
Yeah, it's mine. Don't worry. Yeah, don't worry. Let's get started. I mean, where to begin? Love and Rockets. Talk about Love and Rockets. I mean, that's where we should start. Then we'll get into the book and the special edition.
I think one of the things that is probably really important, again, a lot of you guys are super fucking young. I was like looking around and I was like, man, there's kids a little younger than my students. And my students look super, super young to me. So I think one of the things that is often invisible is is perhaps the narrative of representation. Said another way, I came up in the 80s, and for those of us who came up in the 80s, especially as a Dominican immigrant growing up in New Jersey, as a Dominican immigrant growing up in New Jersey from a very, very humble family, yeah. And you gotta understand the kind of family it was where we were 5, and even though my mom was raising 5 kids on, she was raising them on like $10,000 a year. Like I pulled her records, you know, and I was like, I wanted to see what the 80s, the income was. The income was incredibly low, yet despite raising these 5 kids on $10,000, my mom was like one of those doñas who was like, my mom was a terrifying sureña, you know? And so she got 3, she got 3 of us in college and 1 off to the Marines. And she was like, that shit is a fucking tie. And growing up in a family with like that, the representations of Latinos that I grew up as a young person were almost entirely aberrant. People of color were represented almost just unanimously in the popular culture in such distorted, fucked up ways, if we were represented at all. Most of my childhood was living in what I described, living in erasure. We were utterly erased. And what little presences, what little traces there were of us, of course, didn't seem to have anything to do with the people I had grown up with. And so what ended up happening was when I discovered this comic in the 80s, independent, Love and Rockets, it was the first time in my entire life where I was seeing US Latinos being represented not as fucking monsters or as coons or as some sort of super just, ridiculously toxic set of reductive stereotypes, but as completely normal people. And it was my first lesson in actually, as a kid, seeing Latinos going on dates. Just going on a date without robbing a fucking liquor store or running a fucking drug trade or whatever the other shit that we were being represented as. And it like literally blew my fucking mind because I didn't go to one of those super liberal schools. I didn't go to a private school. I wasn't a prep for prep kids. We didn't have, I didn't grow up with any teachers passing me material. The only thing I had when I was in high school, I read 1 book in my high school by a writer of color, and that was the autobiography of Malcolm X. And so therefore, when I got to Love and Rockets and I saw these 2 brilliant comic book artists who were approaching the Latino and, I mean, Palomar never gets sort of stated as being Mexico, but both the diasporic and the home cultures and representing it so well, it had this profound foundational impact. I mean, I gotta tell you, as an artist, I cut my teeth on these books. I still think the tools that I pulled out of that work are the ones I'm still using.
For my own, I mean, I feel the same way. This comic, in fact, you know, I grew up in the 1960s. I'm 61 now, and there it is. Let's get it all out in front. Let's get it out in front now and over with. 45, I look worse than you now. But you know, I grew up as a comics fan. There was nothing like Love and Rockets. Now, I also kind of grew up where there was no contact with it. I grew up in Washington, D.C. It was like 99% black when I grew up there. There was no, so even the world that I saw in Love and Rockets really wasn't the world that I grew up in, but I connected with the cultural transactions that were going on. Both the characters and the cultural life and the street life, because there's rough life in Love and Rockets also. And in some ways I could connect with that, but it was really a world that I never knew anything about. So that's what drew me into it. But in particular, the characters. I mean, maybe we can talk a little bit about the characters. I mean, really both of them, Gilbert and Jaime. I mean, you did this book with Jaime Hernandez, but really these two guys, they changed American comics, but in a broader way, really they kind of showed where the country and where literature could go.
Yeah, no question. I mean, you know, and it's one of these strange damn things. Like, guys, it's hard to capture what it means if you have no models in your imaginary of your community. If your vocabulary of your imaginary is completely alien. In other words, I always ask, you know, when I talk to my students, I'm like, how many of you grew up, again, this generation's very different. I mean, in some ways not so different, but still, the guys that I grew up with, I said, how many of you can list the stories that you grew up with where a young kid of color or a young girl of color goes on an adventure? I mean, think about it. Just goes on an adventure. And it's extraordinary, like these entire geographies of imagined experience are denied to us. And so when we find things that are in some ways even slightly close to us, you know, I'm not a Mexican kid, I'm not a Chicano kid, I don't know shit about California, I grew up in fucking Jersey, but I connected so powerfully just because somebody was humanizing our communities, man. And it's extraordinary. The same thing happened to me, of course, when I was reading Asian American literature. You know, Asian American literature had such an enormous impact on me because at the time that I was coming up, this was the work that was much more easily accessible to me, and that I was seeing communities of color being written in ways that resonated with what I knew. Like I said, we grew up, and my family broke. Of course, they were motherfucking jodedores, you know? But the ratio wasn't like on NBC. You turn on NBC and it's like, you would think 99% of all Latinos are like malign, fucked up, you know, either semi-prostitutes or semi-drug dealers in one form or the other, plus maids. And that distribution is super fucked up, man, because especially for those of us who are trying to tell stories about the realms of experience that are much more akin to what we grew up with, you know? I don't know. It had a big, big impact on me, man. I still think about Jaime writing about Hopi and Maggie and teaching me how one might aspire to write about women characters. And Beto writing books like Poison River, and Poison River, I'm telling you,
what a great, amazing, complex, epic.
Dude, I basically mugged Poison River to write half of Oscar Wilde. You go out and read Poison River and then read Oscar Wilde, you'll be like, this motherfucker should be paying money.
Where'd you get started? What story leaps out at you? Is there a story that you remember that sort of really grabbed you?
From their books? Yeah, well, I mean, I started right at the beginning, so of course I was reading them when they were still kind of like, we're still trying to figure out their language and still trying to figure out where the trend was. So Jaime was still writing about rockets and dinosaur stuff.
So it was kind of a mashup, science fiction, romance, and superheroes, and this incredible naturalistic world. Latinos, but everybody. I mean, that's what blew me away. This world is sort of ghetto suburban area that they were living in. This surrogate, I guess, for LA, was like nothing I had ever seen. Certainly nothing like Washington, D.C.
No, it was an edge city. And you know, it was just, again, as a kid, I mean, how many people grew up with images of themselves that weren't hyper exoticized, that weren't sort of playing to some sort of crazy, reductive vision of your community. And for me, just having images, those images they have of people who look like my uncle, or people who look like my aunts, or people who look like my neighbors, and they were drawn by people who actually liked their community. I mean, this is what we're talking about in this country. most of us are consuming art created by people who don't either understand or even like our communities. And that's wildly unhealthy. I mean, we won't know how unhealthy it is till the day we finally get the narrative nutrition we require. I mean, could you imagine if our popular culture actually resembled our country? I mean, first of all, 80% of all white actors would be out of work. Because, like, white actors are on some old affirmative action. They're like, oh, we're casting 12 Years a Slave. We're like, let's go to Switzerland. We gotta get some white people in there. You know? And I just think these are important things, though, because for those of us who are working in the imaginary, to tell stories about ourselves, to paint about ourselves, to create films about ourselves, to do movement, often half of our creative work is decolonial. I mean, when I think about, as an artist, how I started out, probably the first 10 years of an artist was trying to remove all of the fucking colonial, just decolonizing my brain, removing all the toxic plaque that accumulates inside of your soul from growing up in a culture that wants to spoon feed you, you know, malign representations of yourself. And I do think one of the first times I felt a healthy drought, like one of the first times that I felt like, my God, this shit was good for me, was Love and Rockets, you know? And it's so rare, so rare.
I discovered Love and Rockets reading The Village Voice sometime about 1985 or so. I saw a little story in there about this strip.
Same exact thing.
I saw this thing and I said, I'd never heard of anything like this before. And, you know, Maggie Hopi, too, bisexual, Chicana, punk rocker, I just did not add up. I ran to St. Mark's Comics and I got an early issue of Mechanics, which is the beginning, and of course they went through big changes. They're his whole vision, but that kind of set me on the road into this amazing world of characters that are become very much like they're people you know. My wife, who started reading the comic many years later, you know, was looking at one of them and she was talking about how, you know, yeah, I like this book, but you know, this one character, Maggie, I mean, he draws her different ways. She's big here, she's small here. And I said, yeah, well, you know, Maggie has always had issues with her weight. And she says, wait a minute, you're talking about, this is a character in a book, you're talking to her like it's someone you know. But these are characters that you come to know.
Yeah, and characters, like, this is what happens when an artist spends a lifetime working on a world. You know, there are great benefits to, again, you know, we live in a culture, and you guys know this, we live in a culture where everything argues for acceleration. We live in a culture where it tells you that if you ain't X already, you're a failure. Where if you ain't graduated from school, you're whack. If you don't already know by the time you're 7 what you want to do, you're a fuck up. If you're an artist and you haven't had your first big show, oh, if you're a dancer and you haven't choreographed a 12-part fucking operatic odyssey. But the reality is that real art is produced in the slow zone. It's produced in the place where you have to listen to those human echoes of yourself. And part of the reason Love and Rockets speaks so powerfully in this question about the dynamicism of the characters, the way the characters change, is because these are artists that completely deny this trend in our culture that everything has to be fast, everything has to be sort of spectacular, and they're moving at a totally different rhythm than the rest of the culture. They're moving at a human rhythm, and therefore what they produce, I think, speaks intimately and uniquely to human beings. Where most of us, when we're on the fast zone, when we're in the machine rhythm, what we tend to produce is shit that doesn't perhaps make people feel more human. It titillates, and it might attract a couple of clicks, but I'm not sure it leaves much behind. And yet, people like us were haunted by a comic we picked up in 1985. And I think this happens when you decide you decide to be a human and create art for humans.
On your point of the the result of time and human interaction. That's not that unusual in fiction. In comics, and in the way that these two guys handle it, it was very different. These are dynamic characters, as you said. They have aged as we have. They have gone through changes. They have kind of fought with each other and withdrawn from each other and returned to each other, as have their friends. And that's one of the other great, wonderful things about this script. As you see lives that act out themselves pretty much as the ones you see around you all the time.
Especially because so many of us belong to communities. You know, again, this is one of the areas where, as an artist, I had to kind of, you know, you kind of have to innovate. You've got to figure out, how do you render community? Because many of us, we don't live in the universe of protagonismo, where it's just like, you're a fucking James Bond, you got no fucking family or friends, and you're just fucking amazing. Well, most of us are saddled with a ton of fucking relatives and a ton of fucking neighbors and fucking exes who never fucking disappear. And we're all, like, we live in communities, man. And as an artist, trying to figure out how best to render communities. Again, this is a culture that loves individual heroics. It's not a culture that likes to narrativize community. And so when you're trying to go against the grain, you have to look for innovations everywhere you can. And for me, this was a great source of innovation in this area. You know, film can render community just by a shot. I show a picture of a bunch of you hanging out, big community. Writing community in fiction, that shit is fucking tough. Poetry, da duro, man. You know, da durísimo.
So tell me, is Hoppers New Jersey?
Nah, but again, for those people who grew up in Jersey, Jersey is
there a connection? Now that isn't the same.
No, I understood,
but
no,
because there are so many things that I see in the Locust series that I feel like I can connect with in your fiction, and especially in these stories.
Well, what happens when you don't live in the city? So the Oxnard, which is where a lot of Love and Rockets is set, it's not LA. The characters, all their dreams are wrapped up in LA. They all want to play in bands in LA, they want to move to LA, they want to live there. That's where their romance begins and ends. And for those of us who grew up in Jersey, you know, if you were like me, come on guys, man, I grew up in the 80s, and I did not know that New York City was going to change the way it changed. My dream growing up was I couldn't wait to get away from all the assholes who just wanted to talk about money, who were going to turn around and just go get married and push double wide strollers, and who were going to fucking buy property and be fucking lames. That was the shit. I mean, hey, there's nothing wrong with being a lame, yo. But that was the shit I wasn't into. Like, I didn't suffer through my high school life because I thought this was a good idea, man. I was like, yo, I want to go live with fucking artists. I want to be an artist. I want to fucking reject all the social bullshit that I grew up with. I didn't want to fucking be down with who's cuter, who got the most fucking money. I want to fucking make art with all the fucking humans, yo. And that's the kind of romance that's produced when you're in a place where even the people who like the place know that it's not significant. Yeah? They know that this is not important to the larger world. This is just your neighborhood. And wanting to write about a space that was, I always joked around, when I grew up, it was between a city and the city. You know, it was just really marginal that way. And yet, I gotta tell you guys, writing about people who are not at the center of history tends to be writing about almost everybody. If there's no better metaphor for who most of us are, is people who are not going to be at the center of history. I guess a lot of us, we grow up wanting to be winners. We grow up that we want to be the one holding the trophy. But my art, I never wanted to write about those people. And I never was interested in that. If there was like a group called The Winners, I was like, I always knew genetically my tribe. I was like, if this is the Dominican Republic in 1937, you know, some of us win and some of us lose in real dramatic ways. Like, it was always my sympathies and emotions were on the losers. And writing about a place that nobody cares about, writing about a place where, for example, if you're just like, I'm from fucking Brooklyn, that shit is cute right off the bat, right? No, motherfuckers are always like they own whole city blocks, like repping Brooklyn, they're like, I'm that motherfucker from that place where nobody cares. You can't even rep Jersey, you're like rep Jersey, people like, I don't give a fuck. And figuring out how to write about that community, it was just something that was so important to me, you know, because there's just something to be said about what is produced when no one thinks that they're on the stage. What is produced when no one thinks that they're making a film of you. When I moved to New York City, I was, for the first few years in like 92, 93, when I moved here, I had a sense everybody in New York was acting out, auditioning for their biopic. They're like, I know in 2 years they're gonna be writing about me. But most motherfuckers in Jersey, we thought the camera was off, you know? So it was a different world, but again, the world I keep returning to, you know? A world I find myself drawn to endlessly.
But let's talk about this project. How did it happen? How did it get going? When did you first meet them?
I wish I could say something like, some incredibly romantic. I have never met fucking Jaime and Beto Hernandez.
Oh man!
Yeah, never.
I met him.
I know you have. But I never meet anybody, yo. I swear to God, I was in the same lot as fucking Obama, and for some reason, I went to get a water when he came by. It was like, it's my fucking luck. No, for real, I came out and I couldn't get out, they locked the doors. And my boys out there like getting pictures and shit. You know? But it was just one of those things that, I have to tell you, I wish it was like, I could say it was some fucking super artistic mastermind project, but it just came about. Somebody said, hey, it would be nice to have a book that was illustrated. Well, what do you think we could illustrate it? And they were like, oh, this dude. And they called me up. Listen, they called me up after they already had the fucking idea. They're like, what do you think about this book? I was like, I mean, if anybody wants to do anything with your work and they're a better artist than you, you're always like, yes, man. Unless you got serious control issues. But for me, I was just really super happy about it. And again, I had almost no contact with Jaime. I was, again, I was just super in awe, so I had nothing to say to him at all. I didn't give him like extensive notes. I know some of you out there, you fucking working with Rembrandt, and you'd be like, here's some notes, bitch. You know? Me, I was just convinced this shit was gonna fucking fall apart. And I put my, si yo me metí mi mano, I was gonna just go. So I didn't say anything, man. I didn't say anything.
You want to talk about some of the drawings? I mean, did you connect with them in any particular way?
Well, I mean,
did he talk with you? Was there any communication at all?
No, it was some old fucking weird art shit.
It was like put together and it was there.
No, the art came and I said, yeah. I just wish more people were like, look like of African descent a little more. But it happens, you know. The next go around we'll have to do this. I mean, look, the thing is, and this is something that was really interesting for me about any kind of collaboration, I usually work too slow to be in a collaborative space. If you're incredibly productive and you work really fast, there's always great opportunities for you to collaborate with people. So it was the first time that I ever had a chance to collaborate with anyone. It wasn't much of collaboration from my side of it, because I just kind of like sat there and just waited for it to be done. But what's fascinating is, as an artist, yeah, no, but as a writer, what's really, really amazing is even as a fiction writer, you leave so much unimagined. You can produce a novel and 95% of the images are being actually created by your reader. You're not even doing the work. You're not like describing the neighborhood. Most of the time there'll be even major characters whose faces are never described. And so there's like a lot of room for an artist, if they want to get involved, to tag your shit up and to fill in the blanks. And that to me was an important part of the collaboration, was the realization that as a fiction writer, as a novelist, a short story writer, you create vast canvases for people to get engaged in. And I think that that's what Jaime had a sense when he read the stories. He was like, this motherfucker didn't think about 90% of this shit. This is gonna be easy. You know, I'm sure in his mind, you know, worked incredibly hard, but it was cool to see what came back, because in the end, it's always the same way as a writer. Every time you write a book, it's not for me. You guys draw these pictures in your own head of who these characters are. And you carry them in your imaginary. You carry them in your heart. And for me, this book was like Jaime's interpretation of it. And it's a beautiful thing to see that, because almost never I get to see any of my readers' versions of my book. You know, most of my readers are not able to show me who they think looks like this or acts like this. We can never have that conversation. And so this was kind of like a telegram, a small letter from the reader zone, a zone that I like adore but almost never get any information from.
Ask for a better interpreter. I mean, Jaime has the ability to create images that are so iconic. They seem to tap into some deep well inside of you, as your stories did.
And you grow up with them. I mean, I grew up with this artist, you know. And again, I think a lot of us, when we're trying to do our work, we're trying to figure out what in the world is going to be the best for us as an artist. And you know, one of the things that was really important to me was trying to figure out how I could dynamically talk about fucked up relationships. That was really important to me, because it's not that I think that all Dominicans or all people from New Jersey or all dudes or anything like this. It's that I watched very close up how the failure of relationships reveals people in ways that nothing reveals anyone. If you really want to get to know someone, break their goddamn heart. Where you want to get to know yourself, get your heart broken. You discover who you are in profound ways. Cats who I thought I knew my whole life, cats who I thought were completely normal, and they would get dumped, and then they would be waiting fucking like Freddy Krueger, waiting in the bush in front of their girlfriend's house, and I'm like, this motherfucker, yo. And as an artist working in this area, again, it mattered deeply to me to find antecedents, to find models, to find people who were writing about heartbreak. I still remember when I was in high school, when one of Jaime Hernandez's stories came out, Human Diastrophism, part 1 and 2. And it was a word I did not understand. A title that was completely mysterious and evocative, and yet it was a story about these fucking Latinos falling out of love. And it made this enormous impact on me, man. A tremendous impact. I mean, it's still, in some ways, I still think I'm still writing my 80s, you know, you're writing my 80s stories in a way. You know?
For me, it was Death of Speedy.
Oh no, Death of Speedy, I teach Death of Speedy. Death of Speedy is just...
It just blew me away. Up to that point, I really loved Jaime's work. I had whatever sort of petty issues I had with it, but I was still obsessed. But there was a depth there that, not even talking about drawing, virtuoso drawing, in that story. That transformed me and really made me totally a fan.
Yo, that was a contemporary U.S. Latino version of a chronicle of a death foretold. The Death of Speedy is an extraordinary piece of work. I mean, extraordinary. You know, again, all of us as artists, we have people who we feel like we're always trying to achieve even close to their level. And for me, I mean, of course, I have like, at a literary level, there's so many models I have. People who I wish I could write anywhere near as close as them. I wish I could like iron their fucking shoelaces, you know? It's like Toni Morrison, Sandra Cisneros, you know, Chamazou, and all these kind of people, you know? And then, of course, the brothers Hernandez stand there towering over me in many ways. which isn't bad. I think there's nothing nicer than to know that when I get started, to know that I'm already in second place, probably more like sixth place. I think as an artist, it's a relief not to imagine yourself at the top of your game. I think it's a relief not to be thinking that you're fucking God's gift to anything. I mean, it spares you so much work. It spares you so much anguish. People who want to be number one, I'm always like, man, what a fucking pay cut. I'm like, I'll settle for number 11. For real, I'm not just saying that, I really believe it.